It's common knowledge that the moon affects the tides and the oceans and the very water across the earth. But if we are 50 to 60% water, how can we deny that the moon affects us? This sort of speculation is as old as human civilization, and even older. Yet, what does the mainstream think of the reference to astrology today? So this talk is not going to get into the technical. It is historical, vastly historical. I will not have time to speak on everything that I'm going to mention. We have to think of how bewildered our ancestors were when looking into the night sky. How strange it must have been. We look at it now with such a context that it seems like anything else. But to them, this would have been to the utmost fascination. It is this phenomena, this wonderment, this study of astrology that is the root of cultures everywhere. It is the impetus of what made math and astronomy and even psychology. It is the very attempt to control our own destiny. To understand the stars was the mark of many things to come. Of course, alchemy being closely affiliated. So we start with carvings on bones in cave walls that are dated as early as 25,000 years ago. So this point in history is truly scattered. We can find fragments, depictions of astronomical, we can call it, observations that are hard to date. But what would be accepted is that we find our beginning in civilization in Mesopotamia, Sumeria, as far back as 3000 BC. We can see that they are naming the constellations and the 7 originating planets, what the Greeks would later refer to as the wanderers, or as they would say, the periplanimosos. This is a sort of offhand reference, but the Sumerian ruler Gidea of Lagash, being 2143 to 2124 BC, describes how the god showed him in a dream which planet constellations would be ideal for building his temple. And here's a big digression. So if this is the originating culture, then this is where we can find the seed of what would later become Islamic, Hindu, Chinese, Mayan, Aztec, Druid, and all other occult tradition-forming astrological systems. And most importantly, at least for our talk today, the roots of the Western tradition. All of them find their root here in Mesopotamia, apparently. That is the best guess that we can say. All of these traditions are highly diverse, just like our languages are highly diverse from one another. But anyhow, we cannot know too much about what happened in Sumeria this early on. The oldest astrological document that we can really put our finger on is the Enuma Anu Enlil. It's allegedly created in the Old Babylonian period, this being 1950 to 1595 BC, and canonized in the Kazite period, being 1595 to 1157 BC. And when we're talking about this early astrology, it's what we call mundane astrology or omens. So this is the sort of thing that the Enuma, Anu, and Leal says. If the lion is black, the land will not be happy. If the king is black, the director of the palace will die. If the raven's star is very red, the flax harvest will prosper. If the Anzu bird's front star is very red, if it is winter, there will be frost, and if it is summer, there will be heat. Venus is seen in the west. She is male. Venus is seen in the east. She is female. If the bowl of heaven's stars are very bright, the offspring of cattle will thrive. You see the kind of taste I'm talking about here. If, then, these are causal statements. The omens, this is how it begins. So, by this time, they were gathering symbols, or creating symbols, or however you want to think about it, that represented ideal times for harvesting, gathering shellfish, fishing with a net or a line, sowing crops, collecting or managing water reserves, hunting, and any form of seasonal tasks. Again, mundane, all the things that help the people live. It would be beneficial to know if the rivers are going to flood ahead of time, because we need that food to live. This was a survival thing. And so we're moving forward, as we are going to be doing this whole time. Around 1800 BC, the Babylonians formed the zodiac, the sequence of constellations that are divided into 12 sections that represent celestial time. These segments are named after animals, or at least most of them. The Greeks later provided the term zodiac because they describe it as the animal circle or the zodiakos kyklos. The order of the zodiac is said to have been inspired by the story arc in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was even earlier made, earliest date saying that it was created in 21,000 BC. So, the late Babylonian period, we see the first ephemeris, which is a journal, what we might think of as an almanac, a farmer's almanac. This was made in 1000 BC. You see how quickly we're moving through time here. To the Babylonians, Ea ruled the waters around and below the earth. That was the god, or however you want to think about it. And Enlil ruled the space between the great above and the great below, along with the atmosphere and the wind. The physical manifestation of the signs in the heavens were meant to portray for humankind the messages from the very creation of the universe. The stars were a channel of communication between the divine and human beings. Divination, therefore, was simply seen as a viewing of the original structure of the universe. It's like a book for us to read. And from this point, we start to see that the introduction of the natal chart is made by the Achaemenid period, or the Achaemenid Empire. This is 550 to 330 BC. So the natal chart, or the natal chart, being a chart that represents where the stars and heavens were, the planets, the wanderers were when a person was born or at a specific time. So you can see how it's becoming more sophisticated, and that's going to be the trend throughout. So between 500 and the year 1, the new paradigm that we recognize as astrology today was established. The theme of this period is model building. It is not a time for testing. It is a time for making a model. So in 525 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Persians, thus imbuing the Egyptian Dendera zodiac with the Mesopotamian influences. So Egypt has had its own way for quite a while as a reactionary to the original knowledge it had inherited, but then the Persians came back with it, imbuing it with their own. And from this point too, simultaneously or in conjunction with, we see that mathematics is flourishing. You have Pythagoras from 570 to 495 BC, then Plato from 425 to 348 BC, then Aristotle from 384 to 322 BC, and then Euclid from 350 to 250 BC. So, bam, bam, bam. Mathematical influences, the development of philosophies, all of this is becoming much more intricate, and it's so easy to see that that these people are reactionaries. These pre-Socratics, these mathematicians are reactionaries. They want to make math in order to better understand the universe and in order to better control their destinies, just like the original intent of astrology promised. So, in 334 BC, Alexander the Great shows up, and everybody knows this one, and he puts Egypt under the control of Greece, or Hellenic rule, and thus Alexandria was formed later, becoming a coalescing point for the many disciplines of astrology in the ancient world. So by this time, the Egyptian decanic astrology, which is where we get the terms deacons. For those who know astrology, you know that there are deacons with every sign. This mixed with Babylonian astrology, and of course forming with the new horoscopic astrology that was really being taken up by the Greeks themselves. And all of this starts to interact, making Alexandria a sort of hub for intellectuals during this time in history. We will be talking a lot about Alexandria later. It is a very important place in the history of astrology. During this very time, just a little bit after this, we can start to speculate that the Antikythera mechanism, now for those who don't know, the Antikythera mechanism was something that was found in 1902 by an archaeologist in the wreckage of the Mediterranean Sea outside of an island called Antikythera, thus what it's named after. And the instrument was later found out to have been a very sophisticated computer, in a way, that tracked stars as they moved along. It was a very good navigational tool for those who are moving across the seas. We could use the night sky to tell us where to go. They don't know exactly when this was made because, go figure, that's a hard thing to say. And the range is anywhere between 205 to 87 BC. So, big range there, but, a little bit after this time that I'm talking about where Alexandria is really becoming this place. The ship crash, however, is more approximate. This happened anywhere between 70 to 60 BC. So, here we go, of course, year one. Need I mention the three wise men? Who were these three wise men? Magi, Maguses, what were they doing? How did they know that Jesus was going to be born, allegedly? By looking at the stars, right? So, here's where we're really starting to jump around a little bit. And you can see how quickly I'm moving. This is a huge expanse of time, and so you see how I'm just absolutely going full on through it. The 2nd century AD, you see the thing that's called the Amalgist and the Handy Tables, written by Ptolemy. And he's a big name in the history of astrology. He finally brings back this idea that I mentioned earlier of the ephemeris, or the ephemeris. Greek is hard sometimes, guys. So, Ptolemy starts to bring back this idea of the daily journals. The daily, this is where this is at, this is where this is at, really tracking where all the stars are moving. And think about how crazy that is. That is such a huge job. And of course, Ptolemy is the one that really puts puts the model out there of the geocentric universe. You know, we are the center of everything, and everything revolves around us. And this, now, don't take credit away from Ptolemy, okay? He was a mathematician, he was an astronomer, he was an astrologer, he was a geographer, and even a magician. Of course, he lived in Alexandria. He made the Amalgist, which to this day is still highly praised because he managed to draw a map of the world with a precision that was remarkable for what we assume the ancient world knew about. And he also devised the astrolabe, which some of you may know is a tool for measuring the distance of the stars and other celestial bodies against the horizon line of our planet. So Ptolemy is a big deal. You know, we don't want to take this away from him, but he did plant this seed for this geocentric model, which will later be one of the things that starts to break astrology down in the public sphere. So in the same time, astrology is taking on its four main features. This being the zodiac, the circle formed by the 12 houses, the 12 constellations, the 12, divided equal sections of the surrounding universe, the planets and their aspects. So all of this is starting to be teased out during this early Greek period. And, of course, another word from Ptolemy that is really good for us to consider, because we're going to get into the more philosophical parts of astrology later on, is that Ptolemy said, the stars incline, but they do not compel. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because, in a way, if we completely believe in astrology and we say, I'm like this because I was born then, and my life's going this way because the clock of the universe is ticking, as it moves, it's fatalism, it's determinism, we can't control anything. We have to assume that's true if we give credit to the stars. Now, if we say it's not true, which becomes a huge point of debate in human history later on, then it's free will, and we accept that everything's fair game. The stars have no effect on us at all. You can see how way back when, before all this fighting starts, Ptolemy says, the stars incline, they do not compel. So it's that middle ground that just would be completely forgotten. So many Greeks were led astray, because you have to think about it. If we are reacting to things that the Greeks said, and we can't translate a lot of it because we're not Greeks and we don't understand the context, the Greeks were doing that with the Babylonians and the Sumerians before them. They were trying to find this knowledge that had been lost in time. And so many of them were led astray by misinterpreting traditions. And, these old masters were sought out, the Magi, the Maguses. And in order to find them, much like how people would go to India today to find this old sort of sacred knowledge, teach me about the chakras and all this sort of stuff, the Greeks would go to Egypt in an attempt to find the sacred teachings inherited by the Persians who came to Babylon, from Babylonia to Egypt. So, this is where I'm going to start to hone in on something. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about more of the daily life, because I was just flowing through history, just bam, 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 bam. So we're going to focus on a time period. This is the 4th century AD. And we're going to talk about Rome. And it is existing simultaneously with Greece at this time. And this ancient library, this library that is a collection of all this knowledge from all these people coming through, the Library of Alexandria. And it's thousands of years of knowledge compiled in all these scrolls in this library. But we're going to get back to that. So, the person that we're going to focus on is Hypatia of Alexandria. Her father is Theon of Alexandria, and he was a mathematician, a philosopher, and a firm believer and practitioner of astrology. Now notice, none of these things are exclusive in the past. They all go together. If you were a learned person, you were a learned person. You weren't a mathematician, a philosopher, an astrologer. That is the modern day marginalizing, breaking these things apart. Back then, this is what made you learned. So, there are no existing records of her mother. And this leads to an interesting speculation. So, Theon, just like many other ancient people in the past, could have constructed the day and time of Hypatia's birth. So, instead of having a wife, as we understand it now, he could have had concubines. He could have had, multiple lovers that he very meticulously would choose to mate with at certain times to obey a very particular arrangement of well-calculated stars. And, in these sorts of different ways to kind of make a forceful labor take place. So it's just an idea, but this is not uncommon. This is our past. The legend of Alexander the Great's birth speaks of the same method. To further this point and to really bring it home, Zoroaster, Horus, and Jesus are all of a long list of prophets that were born under specific stars, like the infamous Star in the East. So it's just an idea, but regardless, Hypatia's intellect was documented from a very early age, and she surpassed her father early in life. And on top of that, she was said to be more beautiful than Cleopatra, which, that was a big deal in the day, right? Like, ooh, Cleopatra. And here we have a woman that excels in everything that she does, and she reaches a throne of authority in a Neoplatonic school and would act as a public figure to the people, sharing wisdoms of the ancient past, and came to represent a sort of purity because she did all this as we'll say a religiously celibate woman, but religiously is kind of a heavy term here. She was a saint, and again, that's a heavy term, but she was amazing and pure and smart, and she was very well endowed with these ancient ways. And Alexandria was a very liberal city, and it had such a large amount of voices that people from all different sorts of creeds and faiths were coalescing here. And the youngest voices were the Christians, who at this time, again, 4th century A.D., were just gaining traction and starting to come with terms with what they collectively believed. They were a very scattered bunch. And meanwhile, way over there, we have the Antiochenes, which is a band of Christians inhabiting a city in the modern-day Turkey. I believe the city is named after them still. I think you can still find Antiochene as a place. And they were reacting to, these sorts of Christian writings that have been coming up for the 4 centuries preceding the alleged life and death of Christ. And so they were questioning the matters of the identity of Christianity. And they weren't a good crowd when it came to women. So they concluded that women were not made in the image of God, but instead were made in an image of an image. And this idea comes from the idea that if Eve came from Adam's rib, and God made him in the image of God, thus Eve is the image of Adam and not the image of God. So Eve is an image of an image, thus she has no authority, and man is the authority. How convenient, right? These sorts of ideals would be what later gets, what later catches on by Christianity's institutionalization, which will be a huge part of this story, but we're saving that. So now that we have this New Age religion, and they were New Age religions, so we can think of like today how we have these New Age religions and how they're kind of like, you know, ooh man, whoa, that's kind of out there. They would have been the real weirdos of this time, and they needed to distinguish themselves in ways that were previously unheard of. Otherwise, they couldn't say that they were any different than these other faiths that were going on, especially you know, Hebrew religions, you know, well, Islamic faiths. Islam wasn't quite there yet, but you know, Jewish, of course. Anyhow, the first commandment reads that you shall have no gods before me, and astrology subscribes to constellations and planets represented by gods, made firm by the Greeks' paganism. So this dilemma leads to contradictions on the topic of astrology within the Bible. So these two don't mesh well. And this is another seed that's going to play in the downplay of astrology later, you know, how it gets broken down and the respect for it gets taken away. So, and I'm going to take a little bit right now, because in theory, astrology is equality, in the sense that there are 6 masculine signs and there are 6 feminine signs. The masculine does not overwhelm the feminine. They are both inclusive, and they both need to operate. This isn't to say that the Greeks themselves didn't have their own patriarchy. As soon as they tried to solidify paganism as a religion for all, it did become patriarchy. It moved away from goddess worship into calling Zeus the big head honcho. In the early days of the Greeks, before the Greeks were the Greeks, they did worship the goddess. They worshipped Gaia and many other goddesses, of course. You know, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to point this out, that in institutionalization of religions, whether it was the Greek paganism or whether it was Christianity later in this story that we're telling, the very act of institutionalization, the very act of this is what we believe, is masculine. And it will inherently downplay women, degrade women, take credit away from women, because men do this. It's the grand old phallus playing. But anyhow, I'm going all over the board here. So the Bible and its contradictions when it comes to astrology. So let's look at some scripture that seems to at least approve of, or at least condone, the use of astrology. So here we go. Genesis 1:14. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the light, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. There we go. Mention of signs seems fine. This next one, Judges 5:20. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. So, a little reference, but the stars are affecting Sisera. The stars are working. So, alright, it works. Now here's another. Matthew 2:1-2. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and come to worship him. There it is. Very light, but, like I said before, star in the east. And then finally, Luke 21:25, and there shall be signs in the heaven, and in the moon, and in the stars. That one is probably the most blatant of all. So these look like, alright, astrology is okay. Why would we have a problem with it? Now here's where the contradiction comes. Here's 4 passages, again, that go against it, alright? So Leviticus 19:26. Neither shall ye use enchantment nor observe times. Very blatant. Don't do it. Deuteronomy 18:10 through 12. There shall not be found among you any that useth divination or an observer of times. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord. Now, that's that Christianity that we know. Ooh, that's rough. All right. Here's another. Isaiah 47:13 through 14. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save ye from these things that shall come upon thee. Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. All right. Burn them. Burn them, is what they're saying. And the last one, Jeremiah 10:2. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of the heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. So, we had this whole history, thousands of years, and here we are, right in the middle of this story that we have. And Christianity is playing both sides. You can find both pros and cons within the lore. Now, I know that the Bible isn't already compiled in this time. This is the time when these sorts of things are being written. So you can see that there are several different influences at play. A lot of these haven't been written yet. Others of them were already written. It's a mess, but this is what we're working with. So, in the mess of these inconsistencies, we can see how these early Christians were a real kind of erratic bunch. On one hand, they wanted to make themselves unique, and on the other hand, they needed to be relatable enough to bring people into their wing. So, maybe there would have been some that took astrology, for truth, and then others who called themselves true Christians, who, threw it all away, and said that anybody who believed otherwise wasn't a real Christian. You could see how this could be a very volatile situation. In any case, the commandment, as read before, says that ye ought not worship any gods before me, right? So any of these gods that were in astrology that, represented these constellations, that would be a hard pill to swallow for them because, they can't worship those gods, there's only just that one, right? And so this assumably is the work of Satan. Go figure, right? I mean, it's always fucking Satan. So, the Christians of Alexandria definitely weren't shy to conflict at all because they had already been hashing it out with the Jews and the pagans, and it was a matter of dominance. We are right and we must be right. All these people are heathens. So after years of being martyred and underrepresented, they kind of fell back on many of these peace-driven ethics because, we gotta give it is true. They were the underdogs. They were highly prosecuted. They were killed. They were, they earned respect for their beliefs. People were willing to die for this, This isn't something that we can take too lightly. But regardless, bad people started to take the helm, regardless of what we think of Christianity as a whole. And so a lot of these, peace-driven ethics just kind of went out the window because dominance, that masculinity that I was mentioning. So, the sixth commandment clearly being that ye shall not murder, but this is by no means the end of Christian contradictions, as we know. So, back to Hypatia. So, she had no hands in the religious violence here. But tension was pervading the city. And she was just like a seasoned academic, She was respectable. She didn't get involved in these things. Her interest was the pursuit of knowledge. But she was a public figure, so when she was speaking, it enticed these ill intentions. Because on one hand, you have these people who are like, you can't talk about astrology, and she's, amazing at it. And on the other hand, they're also sexist, right? So like, women can't be talking up there. Who's she? And so you can see this, this bubbling up. Time doesn't really change, right? I mean, we still have, we still have this to some degree today, right? And so she was so clever, and she was so articulated, and so she must have been such a high threat, because she's blasphemous. And listen to these sacrilegious claims, and all these false deities, and she's a woman. God. So the story that goes on is that Hypatia was returning home in her chariot, and a gang of Christians led by a name Peter the Lector stopped her. They dragged her out of her chariot into a nearby church, cut her to pieces with either floor tiles or pot shards, depending on which reference. And some sources also say that they raped the religiously celibate Hypatia, contradicting the seventh commandment that ye shall not commit adultery. But anyway, after her death, this other guy, John of Niku, which was a predominant Christian leader in the city at this time, commemorated his pupil Cyril, and named him the new Theophilos, which is Greek for the friend of God. Theo, God, Philos, friend. And the reason he gave him this title is because he had destroyed the last remains of idolatry in the city. Powerful stuff. Powerful stuff here. So, this savage murder was brought on by these, we can call them early Christian extremists. And it brought on this slow death of paganism and started to usher in this blood-soaked age of religious predominance. Astrology and its associative ties with paganism was now a burden, and it was left to the mercy of a growingly institutionalized Christianity. So this pagan idolatry was waning from public discussion beyond this point. The Christians this was their tipping point. Hypatia was the last wall in a way. And so they moved quickly to eliminate any further obstacles to their predominance. And so their eyes turned to the Library of Alexandria, as I mentioned long ago. And this is speculative on my part, okay? But hear me out. This is the largest known library of the ancient world. It shelves well over 700,000 scrolls pertaining to science, philosophy, poetry, mathematics, and especially the long history of astrology, which I mentioned a lot earlier, had inspired these other disciplines. Even poetry, so the Epic of Gilgamesh was about astrology, so like all of it coming from astrology, and all of it was compiled here. And the story of the library's demise is filled with uncertainty. Its demolition served to erase an abundant history of ancient knowledge in the world, and we will never get that back. Imagine what was truly lost when that library burned, and that's what happened. That's what I've been teasing at here. It burned to the ground, and the only group that would benefit from such a thing, even if it was just an accident, sure, I'll entertain it, even if it was just an accident, were these early Christians. The more that people knew about astrology, the worse. Any knowledge of astrology or any ancient pagan philosophies threatened the integrity of the newly made church. And we see how this starts to come into play. So 391 AD, the emperor, let me try to say this one, Theodosius, officially outlawed pagan practices. So that's quite the turn. We have, a whole thousands of years of history of pagan practices, and now it's outlawed? What a switch. The destruction of this library happened coincidentally shortly after. And again, it could just be an accident. The less that people had to consider, the more the church, or this new Christianity, could monopolize knowledge. And we know that Christianity isn't shy on monopolizing knowledge. We see this today still with the 40-mile-long underground library that the Vatican City has. And, this isn't public knowledge, but there is a library, and nobody knows what's in it. I mean, aside from them, of course. And from what I know, only one scholar has ever been allowed to be in there to read one book that was given to him that he could only read under the supervision of guards. This is old as Christianity, and it's as new as the modern Christianity, right? It's still happening, this monopolizing of knowledge. Let's keep these things away so that we can keep at it, boys, huh? So that's kind of the end of my hyper-focus on this point of history. We're going to move along and continue our story of this brief history of astrology. So from 500, which is just after this point I'm talking about, till at least 1700, 17th century, Christianity spread tremendously throughout Europe. Its peak being the 1500. And I don't need to talk about the Crusades. I don't need to talk about the whole medieval period. Astrology was around. It was around. I'm not saying it wasn't. It just had been, it wasn't what it was. So skipping way ahead, we're at 1200 now, 1225 to 1274. The dude is St. Thomas Aquinas, an Italian philosopher, theologian, and a highly influential figure in Christianity. And he believed that predicting the destiny of man in the stars was a demonic illusion. So you can see how far this has gone. However, there were great minds that opposed such a schema during this time as well. Robert Bacon, who died in 1248, being very notable. And of course, Copernicus, as everybody knows, 1473 to 1543, he very heavily studied astrology, and that's what brought on his claims of astronomy and bringing up this scientific revolution of the heliocentric model. Now, you remember way long ago I mentioned how Ptolemy made the geocentric model. Well, here's where it's coming back. And then after Copernicus, we have Nostradamus, 1503 to 1560. He was an astrologer. His claims were so crazy that the lordships at the time had to pay attention to him because they were coming true. And then, of course, John Dee, big name in occult circles, 1527 to 1609. Can't forget Galileo, 1564 to 1642. And of course, much later, well, actually not much later, because the year that Galileo died, Newton was born, 1642 to 1776 or 1726, who deeply delved into astrology, although his interest in it may have been due to his works in alchemy. It's kind of hard to tell the difference when it comes to a lot of these people who studied this stuff, because you couldn't study alchemy without knowing astrology, and you couldn't know astrology really without leading it to alchemy. And again, I'm going to bring this back. It's all about man controlling his destiny by looking at the secrets of the heavens. And if any way there is possible to live the most genuine life, or for most to be immortal, or for some to find the philosopher's stone, the secret of it all. This was the pursuit, and during this time, all these people, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, they all were studying, but they had to hide. They were the exception, not the rule, and this had been this way since 500. And so several events break astrology down even more. So the 30-Year War, which was 1618 to 1648, this was a time in Europe where the horror of witches and evil was being brought about by the church, and astrologers were seen as charlatans, heathens, that would exploit the people's fears and lead them away from the true way. So to be known to study this stuff meant death. Oh gosh. There's all sorts of stories here how the alchemists would have to hide. They could only work so much, and so if they were working with mixing elements, they would need to use fire, but they would need to not let out too much smoke, because then they could be caught by the church because they were always watching. It's the same sort of thing that we have today with the sort of FBI, CIA, NSA thing where we always feel like we're being watched. That was the church of their day. It's history repeating itself. They will come and they will get you if you look too deep into things, if you know too much. They will kill you. They will do terrible things to you, even your family. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so the 30 Years' War did it, and this growing thing called rationalism. So the Renaissance did bring it back. We need to find this thing that we've lost, because Christianity had led people astray in a way they felt unfulfilled. So they did look back at astrology because it's inextricably tied with this ancient knowledge of the past, and so rationalism is climbing up, and it's science as we know it. So, when I'm mentioning Newton, when I'm mentioning the heliocentric model finally kind of breaking away from the church's grasp, that too, both Christianity and science together are beating down astrology, because for science, it was more of a thing of that astrology was much more psychological and based in gods, which felt religious to this more dry-minded thing made by Descartes and later Kant. They were far too dry and just logic-based to entertain anything this fanciful in their minds. That's how they would have thought about it. But again, this is like the originating stuff. Like, oh, man, okay. Rationalism did it. Science later did it. Christianity still at it. But the flame has always been retained. So, Goethe, for instance, in 1749 to 1832, in his literary works, he mentions his own horoscope even in public, and he's writing about the influence of the stars. And then, of course, the name that most probably recognize, Alexander Crowley, 1875 to 1947. Huge in the resurgence of these occult traditions, these occult revivals, and an inspiration for the Theosophical Society, which brings astrology into kind of a resurgence in conjunction with the spiritualism movement. And you see, we're finally getting into this modern day, right? So, there's that kind of spiritual aspect that brought it back, but then there's also, the more relatable, I guess, is something as simple as Ronald Reagan having a personal astrologer who was accredited for saving him from an assassination attempt. So it's not just for the weirdos, In the upper echelon, they entertain this stuff. And there are not famous names, but those who study astrology would know names like Alan Leo. He was bigger in the early 1900s. And then like John Addy and Reinhold Eberton and Liz Green and Noel Tile, and now current astrologers Rob Hand, Stephen Forrest. This has continued to the modern day, but it's kind of this substratum thing. It's kind of out there, and what people know in the general public is Vogue magazine. They know it as something that's confirmation bias, something that's made so general that anybody can believe it, something that's pseudoscience, that's the big word, hooey, just not worth entertaining, because as many of us know, science is the great god of the century, the great thing to follow. And science says no, so thus astrology must be bad. So we've finally done it. We've effectively worked through, if we start with the 25,000 years ago and the bones in the caves, or whether we started, 7,000 years ago with Sumeria and Mesopotamia. This is the story as it's gone on. It is our it's our birthright to look up at these stars and to wonder what they have to tell us. That there's a reason for why they are where they are. It started with omens. It started with insane knowledge that was true, that would predict floods, that would predict when wheat would grow well, and it moved into personal stuff. They made the horoscope, and then it was psychological, and they could understand how people would be affected by these things. And then later they would come to fight about this difference between determinism and free will. And like I said way earlier, Ptolemy, who's just like, it affects us, but it doesn't make it so. Like it inclines us, but it's not determinism. So, it was so big, and then it came down, and it's just been fizzling down ever since. And it's not fair in a very real way. It's not fair how it's lost favor. And it's not fair what Vogue magazine does to our perception of this great, sophisticated knowledge that we've inherited throughout our whole history. And there's so much to take away from this story. There's so much to be had when it comes to the technicalities and this building of knowledge throughout all of our history. It once was this, and then it became this, and now we are inheriting this very labored work of knowledge that people have gone through to study the heavens, and who knows how deep it goes. We can't know, because so much of it was burned and taken away, and so many of these great voices were silenced in the name of what? For other than for power and for control. And even in the modern day, do we forgive science for completely disregarding the merit of astrology? It is simply, by definition, astro, the sky, astral bodies, logi, the study, so the study of the sky, the study of the astro. Is it something that we should so easily forget about? Is it something that we should let be disregarded? The future of astrology is unknown. Go figure. I mean, we should look into the stars and ask. But this is the story, whether for good or whether for bad. And it's not just some hooey. It comes from somewhere. It means something. And there's so much more depth to be had. And I hope that I've given some clarity on the overall story that we're inheriting. I want to thank you guys for hearing me out on this one. I know it's all over the boards, but I hope you guys got something out of this.